Hello everyone, today we're going to talk about why being a sheriff in the Wild West was such a nightmare. There was a rule that everyone knew in the dusty streets of the Wild West. You had to choose someone to protect the town, but that meant it was the end for the person who was chosen. In those days, the sheriff was seen as the bravest man in town. He was greeted like a king, and everyone respected him. But no one knew about the nightmares he had, the threatening notes he found on his door every morning, or how he sacrificed himself to protect his family. Being sheriff was just about wearing a star on paper. But that star was nothing more than a target drawn on his chest. Think about it, you're alone, you're the only lawman in town, there are dozens of armed outlaws facing you, and the townspeople are counting on you for everything. So, was being a sheriff really heroic, or were they helpless victims? You'll find out soon enough. Once you hear what being a sheriff in the Wild West really meant, you'll never look at those heroes in the movies the same way again. Now, grab your coffee or tea, sit back, and join us on this journey. How to get sheriff's job? Today, you would have to take exams to become a sheriff in a town. But things were very different back then, because in the Wild West, you didn't really have to do much to become a sheriff, because, frankly, no one wanted to be one. In most towns, being sheriff was a volunteer position. Because the pay was low, there was almost no authority, but in return, there was the constant danger of being killed. The townspeople would first look for volunteers, and if they couldn't find any, they would force someone to take the job. Either you'll do it, or our town will be left without a sheriff. In some towns, elections were held. The people would unanimously elect the best marksman or the bravest person. But sometimes the elections were just for show, because, in reality, no one wanted to wear that star on their chest. When you looked at the winner's face, you couldn't see any expression of victory, because everyone knew wearing that star was like having your name engraved on a tombstone. And the real tragedy was this. The people treated you like a lawman, but criminals saw you as a living target. Neither the people nor the law fully protected you. So why did some still accept this duty? Was it courage, necessity? Or was it simply a death, accepted in the hope of being remembered as a hero afterward? You will soon learn what happened to those who volunteered for that duty, ensuring justice on your own. The moment you pin the star to your chest, you are alone. The townspeople have chosen you, but after choosing you, they turn their backs on you. There were no laws in the Wild West. There were no courts. The law books were only on paper, and you were the only one who could bring them to life. When a band of outlaws entered the town, the people would immediately close their shops and hide in their homes. The only person who would venture out into the streets was the sheriff. There was no one to help him. Most of the time, he didn't even have a deputy. In fact, depending on the town's finances, they sometimes struggled to find a sheriff, let alone a deputy. It wasn't just a few outlaws. Sometimes a 20-person armed gang would come with them and open fire on the streets. And in that town, justice was in your hands alone. As bullets flew, people would tell you to enforce the law, but the law was on your back, and the bullets were in your chest. And even if you drove them away, the next day they would come back in greater numbers to try to take you, because you were the only one who could stop them in that town, and they could only be free by killing you. Sheriffs often upheld justice, but often they paid for it with their lives. So, was it really possible to uphold justice alone? Or was justice in the Wild West just a myth? Dealing with gangs. The biggest nightmare of the Wild West was the inevitable gangs, because they were chaotic but ruthless. They didn't care about the law, they only spread fear, and stopping them was a sheriff's sacred duty. When the gangs entered town, the townspeople were divided into two groups, those who locked their doors and those who watched in fear from their windows. But there was no third option, because standing up to them was solely the sheriff's job. On those nights, sheriffs relied only on their guns and their courage, but sometimes courage wasn't enough, because the men they faced outnumbered them, were better armed, and had nothing to lose. Some gangs would harass the same town for weeks, firing bullets at the sheriff's house to intimidate the people. Others would threaten to kidnap the sheriff's family, or come one night and eliminate him, because as long as the sheriff was alive, the town was free. But when the sheriff fell, the town belonged to them. That's why being a sheriff in the Wild West was actually a lifelong battle. And for most sheriffs, that battle didn't last very long. What about you? If you were the sheriff in that town, could you look the gangs in the eye? Or would you just drop your badge and choose to run away? The lawless lawman. Being a sheriff in the Wild West meant enforcing justice. But no one knew exactly what justice was. There were law books back then, yes, but what was written in those books was not considered valid in the town, because there was no court to enforce those books, let alone a judge or even a jury. The law was solely in the sheriff's hands, and this made him both the most trustworthy man in town and the most dangerous, because sometimes sheriffs became lawless themselves. Some became the toughest men in town, seizing criminals' property and imposing their own rules. Sheriffs who said, "I am the law," would eventually turn from heroes to nightmares for the people. But there was no other way. Because in a place where the law didn't work, sometimes even the lawman had to become a criminal. The people feared the sheriffs, but they still had to obey them, because when they left, the town would fall into the hands of gangs. Being a lawman in the Wild West was not easy. If you enforced the law, the people would consider you an enemy. If you turned a blind eye, the criminals would consider you an enemy. And one day, the people might try to lynch you, because being a sheriff meant earning everyone's hatred. So, who could really blame a lawman for becoming lawless? Or was the real crime in the Wild West simply surviving? Family and personal life? In the Wild West, everyone thought the sheriff was powerful, but no one thought he had a son, a wife, or a dream. Sheriffs were not only lawmen, but also fathers, husbands, and human beings. But no one cared about that. Every morning, as he left his house, he would look at his wife as if for the last time, because no one could be sure he would return. The goodbye look left at the doorstep might have been the last farewell. Gangs targeted not only the town but also the sheriff's home. If they couldn't defeat the sheriff, they would harm his family. Those who threatened to kidnap his child, those who threw Molotov cocktails at his house at night or simply fired bullets at his window to instill fear. The sheriff's family suffered even before the trigger was pulled. That's why some sheriffs left their homes. They sent their wives to distant cities and couldn't see their children's faces for months. Because being a lawman also meant being alone. In the Wild West, love was overshadowed by fear. And no child should have to understand that their father was walking toward death every day. But some children never saw their fathers grow up, because those fathers died while carrying the star of the law. So, is it heroism for a man to sacrifice himself to protect his family? Or is it to quietly crumble? Hollywood legends. We've all seen it in Hollywood movies. Two men face each other on a dusty street, they stare at each other. The duel begins. The sheriff is always the fastest draw. The townspeople cheer. The gangsters flee. And the day is written in the name of a hero. But, in reality, nothing like this ever happened. Duels were very rare in the Wild West. Most conflicts took place in ambushes, not in the middle of the street. Gangs would come at night, trying to catch the sheriff while he slept. The people would watch from their windows in fear, but no one would cheer. Hollywood portrayed sheriffs as heroes and outlaws as villains. But sometimes it was impossible to tell who was good and who was bad in the town. In the movies, the sheriff's star shines like gold. In reality, it was a rusty piece of iron, and most of the time, it was covered in bloodstains. Hollywood portrays sheriffs as heroes who take down dozens of people with a single bullet. But most real sheriffs weren't that lucky, and they weren't that fast. They were alone, afraid, and sometimes just trying to survive. Being a sheriff in the Wild West was not a heroic tale, but a tragedy and a sacrifice. So the next time you watch a Western movie, don't remember that star-studded man as a hero, but as a lonely man crushed under the star, because in the Wild West, every star had a price, and that price was often life itself. Conclusion: a heroism or a nightmare. Being a sheriff in the Wild West was heroic in the eyes of others, but in the eyes of the sheriff himself, it was a complete nightmare. For the townspeople, he was a symbol of order, but he had no order of his own. Every morning brought a new threat, every evening a new fear. Nights spent away from his family, death waiting around every corner. Being a sheriff meant giving up your own life, devoting yourself solely to the survival of the town, and being rewarded with loneliness, fear, and pain in return. Some called it courage. But for most sheriffs, it was simply a necessity, because someone had to wear that star in a town, and in the end, that star was always stained with blood, not like Hollywood taught us. Being a sheriff wasn't a heroic tale, it was a story of quiet sacrifice and a tragic ending. Now, I ask you, if you were in that town, would you wear the star and walk the streets? Or would you close your door and close your eyes like everyone else? Perhaps that was the real question of the Wild West. To be a hero or to survive? So if you were there, would you wear the star? Write your thoughts in the comments. If you liked the video, don't forget to like it and subscribe to stay updated on future videos.